Joe Henty waited behind the till of the video shop with his evidence held tightly in his hand. He rocked, unconsciously, back and forth, and continued to mutter an alphabetized list of movies starring Bette Davis. Before that he had listed the movies he had seen in the cinema with Daisy, then the films they had brought the kids to see, anything to keep that evil litany from his lips. The meeting was scheduled for 6 in the evening after he closed up the shop, but no one had arrived. They went to the back and called the few numbers he had for the few people he already knew, but nobody answered. He called the girl he had met in the park, but her husband answered, so he hung up quick and went back to his seat behind the till and waited. The day had begun with a humid, close heat that seemed to stick to your skin. Unusual for the time of year, but it quickly abated and exploded into a storm. Now as he sat and waited, rain spattered the windows with such a frenzy that it drowned out the sounds of tragedy that littered the streets of Avis. The occasional cry of despair could be written off as a howl on the wind, but Mr. Henty could not explain away the feeling of dread that lay heavy in his core. His wife had been padlocked in a wardrobe for weeks, her wrists tightly bound together, her arms tied tight to her sides. He hadn't slept in as many days, occasionally letting his head drop, then jumping awake, chased out of sleep by nightmarish visions. "What should I do, Mary?" he asked, clutching his picture, a dark, blurry, easily dismissed image of an animal hovering over his wife. Since capturing some picture of it, he had hit the library hard. He knew Avis was a strange town, with a dark history, but he had no idea quite how strange or how dark. He learned that the town of Avis, once Lockford, had fallen many times and grown again, like a phoenix out of the ashes. It seemed perfectly located on the Thames, so that no matter what happened there, or how many times the people fled or perished, it got up and running again. Every couple hundred years, some traveller would come across its ruins and stick a flag in the ground. Somehow the name Avis stuck, the history bled through into the present, and prey were lured back. The church that once stood on the ground of the Weeping Lakes had been described in medieval texts. Many travellers, even notable historical figures, had come across it and remarked on its beautiful stained glass. Mr. Henty found it in the Doomsday Book, but its origins are unknown. Who built it? How old was it? And why did the stained glass depict images of animals reigning over the land like kings or gods? The Avis Community Library wasn't particularly useful. It had a limited supply of texts on demonology, alternative religions, or paranormal phenomena. He asked the librarian for every book they had on any subject, even remotely related, and she piled them up on his table. A great excuse to stay away from home, to have peace from her rattling in her wooden box. After hours of poring through relatively useless information, he picked up the next book to reveal something else underneath. It was a book, he supposed he could call it that, but it was handwritten, pictures chaotically penciled over the text, the cover torn from a Bible and hand-stitched to these new, maddening pages. The Litany was scraped into the leather, and underneath a name, Curtis Twinge. He looked up at the librarian, ready to ask her what this strange book could be, but she was already staring, from her seat behind the desk. Their eyes met, and without speaking she told him not to ask, just to take it and never bring it back. He arrived home as it was getting dark and went straight to Mary. She was sweat-covered, growing thin, her face still healing from the scratches she inflicted with the broken glass slides. She smiled as he wiped her forehead with a cool towel and held food up to her mouth. "It's all right, Mary. I've got a book. I think someone else knows what's happening in Avis. I've met with other people too. They're going to collect evidence and we're going to figure this out." "There's nothing to figure out. Your wife is just mad, Joe. You should just throw her away." The voice escaped her pale lips but was not her own, but her eyes conveyed the truth. His wife was trapped and struggling for her life. He locked the wardrobe again and went downstairs. The bag containing the book seemed to vibrate with energy. It sang to him, called his name. It felt like light and love and everything he wanted. It also felt like darkness and death, and things you'd choose death over. He set it on the table that his daughter had used to balance when she took her first steps, that he and Mary had played cards on or done jigsaws on for years. It felt like looking out of a window onto something ugly and terrible, and then opening the door to let it into your family home. It felt dirty just touching it, but it was the only answer to bringing his wife back. He was sure, just from looking at it, that it was Avis, that it was the answer to it all. The first 8 pages were simply names. He recognised the historical ones, then later he recognised the names of people who had gone missing in his town, or had a worse fate. Some before his time, but whose stories were remembered. Others recently, like the Bailey's boy and Colin Cropper, those poor girls from the cinema, Laurie Ingram. "It's a small town with no jobs. No wonder everyone leaves," he said aloud to the room, repeating the line he had said to his wife many times over the years, making sense of all the disappearances. On the 9th page was a picture. It looked like it had been drawn over thousands of times. The paper was thin and torn in places. It was a lot of things. A bird, yes, but also a cat, a goat, a woman. It had wings, hooves, sharp teeth, long arms, and those eyes. He slammed the book shut and put the bag on top of it. He stood and paced around the room, and then he vomited. He felt a cold sweat cover his body as he began to cry. He was ill-equipped. He knew it. A month ago he laughed and shrugged off the superstitions of the townsfolk, thought of himself as a logical man. Now he felt gripped with terror, afraid of a book and his own wife. He knew where the old Twinge house was. He had never seen it, but he had heard the stories. Knew his son and his friends would dare each other to walk through the woods and knock on the door, but none had ever made it, always run back to the group, shaking and pretending to laugh it off. He had heard the story about Belinda and Thomas Twinge, double suicide, horrible circumstances, orphaned boy. Could he do what those rambunctious teens could not? Could he make it through the forest and knock on the door? He was frightened, but more frightened at the thought of reading through that book alone in his house with that demon upstairs. The morning of the arranged meeting with his co-conspirators, he had packed the book in his bag and scrawled a quick note that he left on the table before leaving for the old Twinge house. The weather was thick and unpleasant. The ground was wet with the dew and the sky had an unfamiliar colour. The forest was seemingly creeping with constant sounds that had his heart jumping into his throat as he barreled on, insistent that if he was to die, it would at least be after speaking with young Mr. Twinge. The house was derelict, the door hanging open, windows broken, and wooden panelling falling into decay. He thought all hope was lost and perhaps the man he sought was already gone, until he saw a shadow through a dirty window. It seemed like a man, but hunched and slow, hobbling. Mr. Henty entered the house and cringed at the creaking of the floorboards. "Hello," he called out, and the sound of scurrying, things being knocked on the ground, got closer. "Curtis Twinge?" He tried again, and finally a man stepped into the light. He was withered and pained. He squinted and held his arm up to shield it from the natural light cast by the open door. All lights in the house were out, and Mr. Henty noticed shattered glass underneath each one, as if turning them off had not been enough. You should leave," he said, and his voice broke. He clearly hadn't spoken in a long time. He looked like he hadn't eaten in a long time too, nor bathed for longer than that. "I have your book," said Mr. Henty, taking it out of his bag and holding it out. "Funny, I have my book too," said Curtis, and he gestured to the table in the living room where an identical copy of the Litany lay open on that horrible picture. "How many copies did you make?" "How many years have I been writing? I have to keep writing, you know. I write down what words I can make out, the rest is such a choir, all singing different words at once." Mr. Henty walked into the living room and opened his copy to the same page. They were identical, but clearly still hand-drawn. He turned the pages of both books in unison, flinching at the pictures he hadn't seen yet, at the prophecy taking shape before his eyes. "Why is this happening? How do you know about it?" Curtis sat down on the floor and buried his head in his hands. "There's no time for that," shouted Mr. Henty, and Curtis shouted back. "There's so much time. I feel I've been alive for millennia, in this house for hundreds of lifetimes, and all it's the same." Mr. Henty turned back to the book, rushing through pages, skimming the words. "What is the Litany? You called the book it, you scrawled it across these pages, the title, but not the words themselves. What is it?" "It isn't. I can't say it. I can hear it, but I can't process it, not into words. It's all messed up with those names, with their voices. It's like it ate them and they became a part of it." "Have you seen it?" Mr. Henty asked, holding up the picture in the book. Curtis started shaking his head, looking down, not looking at the picture. "I've seen it," said Mr. Henty. "It climbed into my wife right before my eyes. It hovers over me in sleep, paralyzes my body, and whispers sweet evils into my ear." "Oh, what will you do?" asked Curtis, his eyes wide now, searching Mr. Henty's face like he may have some answer that was just out of reach. "I thought you might have some suggestions. Is it something we can kill? Is it even alive? Can you touch it?" It can touch you," Curtis replied, and touched his elbow tentatively. "All right, then perhaps we can take it out. The names, why did you write them?" I heard them. I just wrote what I heard. If it was a name, I put it at the front. Just a word or a ditty, something small. I'd put that anywhere. Then the poems, the songs, the fables, I put those at the back." "What are those?" Mr. Henty pointed to a stack of similar-looking books piled up like a mountain in the corner. "Copies?" No, those are my dad's books," he replied. Mr. Henty crossed the room quickly and opened up a few books, throwing them aside once he got the gist. "They're the same. Different names, but basically the same." "My father was mad," said Curtis. "I think we might all be mad," replied Mr. Henty. "Some sickness. Maybe the town was built on toxic waste. It's the water or the plants." Curtis cut him off. Their eyes met, and Mr. Henty remembered Edmund Croft. a poet from the 1800s, not from Avis, but he discovered and named the famous vine that every inhabitant of Avis had seen at some time in their lives. The birdcage, he said. That botanist came and said it wasn't harmful, but his name is in my book. I've heard his voice too. I think he's... Croft too. His wife went mad. They killed themselves. A silence settled between them, and while Curtis scratched and shivered, Mr. Henty looked around searchingly. So what? A poisonous plant? An animal? Some singing in our heads? Is that all? How can we fight a plant? No, you can't fight. Proximity. Proximity, that's the answer. I heard if you throw a stone from Avis that has a hole in it up in the air 3 times you can leave. I've heard that about a lot of towns, Mr. Henty replied, exasperated. I've heard the screams of the taken. I've heard the congregation chanting in the pews. Proximity is our only hope. So go outside and find a holy rock. I can't go outside. It prowls around the house at night, and in the day it could see me better. It ate my milkman. I'm very hungry. What did you mean by congregation? It has followers, not just me. Some people like it, say it's a god or fairy. My cousin Kira got involved in some group. She said I owed the house to her, that there was energy here and a way to break to cross the divide into the other world where this thing lives. Can I talk to her? No, she's, her name's in my book now. And her body's in the basement, said a cruel voice in Mr. Henty's head. He made eye contact with Curtis and knew he had heard it too. He stood, with his copy of the book, and walked towards the door. Will you find a holy rock? Asked Curtis behind him as he started his walk back through the forest. So now here he sits, waiting to tell his friends what he has found. Perhaps put together a plan to evacuate the town, talk to the mayor of Whitney, rehouse people while real investigators look into the odd occurrences. He had some solid evidence now, and who knew what the others would bring. Mr. Henty, came a voice, accompanied by banging on the door. Mr. Henty, please, let us in. He pulled back the corner of a film poster and peered through the window. The rain was coming down hard, and flashes of lightning illuminated the street where Debbie and Shannon Bailey stood huddled together.